Story 1. My friend invited me to a sleepover at his house. We weren't allowed to wake up before his parents. When I was 11, I was at the very bottom of my class until the teacher, Miss Henry, made me sit next to the new kid. Thomas and his family moved into town halfway through term, so he just sort of appeared one day. During his second week, Miss Henry tried to draw him out of his shell by asking about his favorite TV program. "What's a TV program?" He replied. That got a laugh. Clearly, he was playing dumb to put one over on her. Everybody thought he'd emerge as the next class clown, but instead, he rarely spoke and aced every subject. A few girls tried befriending him. They dug the Children of the Corn look, I guess, but agreed he was a weirdo after chatting with him in the lunch hall. As desk buddies, he and I locked horns. A lot. Because I was left-handed, our elbows bumped together whenever we wrote, and he got super pissed anytime I asked to borrow a pencil, so I of course did this as often as possible. Anytime I asked Miss Henry to split us up, she'd just sneer and say, "Ryan, there's going to be times in life when you're forced to spend time with people you don't like. Get used to it." One day, as I struggled with a difficult maths exam, Thomas offered to help. I'm guessing he finished early and got bored. It was my first A. Without either of us ever agreeing to it, he started helping me with homework and tough assignments, and soon my grades improved so much my mom bought me a bunch of Pokémon cards as reward. I offered Thomas some of the one I already owned, but he didn't even know what a Pokémon's was. Then one day, out of the blue, he asked if I'd sleep over at his place. "Father really wants to meet you," he said. Why did his parents even know who I was? We sat together, sure, but he knew so little about pop culture, getting through a conversation was like chewing cult. Still, I wanted to thank him for his help, and my mom didn't raise any objections, so that Friday I packed some clothes and cycled over to his place. I drove down several short roads flanked by woods, past a train station, toward the outskirts of town. Thomas's two-story house sat at the top of a long driveway so steep that I needed to jump off my bike and push most of the way, and all the windows were either boarded up or had the curtains pulled shut. Things got spooky the second I arrived. Thomas and his parents waited patiently to greet me, each grinning like they were on a poster for tooth whitening. Everybody had matching blonde hair and dressed in plain shades of brown, gray, and white. A large man introduced them as the Donovans. My pre-teen brain categorized him and his wife as old, but in retrospect there must have been a 20-year age difference there. Mr. Donovan walked my bike into the garage while me and Thomas followed his mom inside. Something was wrong with the house. It looked too sterile. No clutter, 0 toys scattered about. Plus, the antique furniture was older than my grandparents'. In every room, sheets had been draped over objects mounted along the paneled walls, and Mrs. Donovan made a point of telling me that touching the sheets is strictly forbidden. She led us into a sitting room decorated with crucifixes, and more crucifixes, of varying sizes. We kneeled down on a colorful rug, facing each other. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. At last, Mr. Donovan joined our group and led a prayer for the standard stuff: good health, blessed weather. Even though I'd gone to Protestant church with my grandparents, I couldn't figure out what religion we were meant to be practicing. He obviously thought of himself as a spiritual leader and devoted a lot of time to the blind sinners who would suffer swift retribution on Judgment Day. It wasn't until he called for a minute of holy silence that I heard a low, shaken voice. I concentrated hard, tuning out the clock. There were muffled cries from somewhere within the room. I peeked my left eye open. Nobody was watching, although the way the family didn't stop grinning made me shiver. I glanced around the room. We were alone. When I turned back towards the circle, Thomas's mom was staring straight at me, her smile practically splitting the seams of her face. Quickly I shut my eyes, already anxious to go home. The silence seemed to last forever. Finally, the spiritual leader clapped his hands and said we should go out back and toss a ball around. On my way out of the room, I listened for more cries, but the sound had died off. I figured my imagination got the better of me. As Thomas and I tossed a leather ball back and forth in the long grass, his dad watched from a crew decking area, beaming. Like at school, Thomas threw with his right hand, whereas I favored my left. We kept trying to pass each other bad shots, competing to make the other miss a catch. It was all in good fun, though. Thomas acted even weirder than at school. Away from his parents, he at least seemed interested in subjects like TV, but now he strictly spoke about Bible stories and recited his favorite verses. I sidestepped his questions my spirituality as much as I could. My arm was aching by the time Mrs. Donovan called us for dinner. In the kitchen, we gathered around the table, and then she brought in a metal pan, presenting 5 boneless chicken breasts lathered in lumpy gravy and canned peaches. Before we ate, everybody linked arms for another prayer, and part of me wished the ritual would never end, because then we'd need to choke down the food. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then those cries started up again, closer than before. It sounded like a child, and their voice had a panicky quality. If it wasn't for the threat of another glare from Thomas's mom, I would have peeked. As the prayer dragged on, the crying became more hysterical, until finally something rattled against the wall behind me. Mr. Donovan's voice raised, thunderous now, and drowned out the sound. I'm not sure which scared me more, but either way my arms broke out in goosebumps. The sermon ended 5 minutes later, and we sat there in silence until the head of the table said, "Amen." I checked the corners for sobbing children, finding only more sheets. What then? A CD player? My imagination? The uncooked chicken made me gag. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I picked around the moldy peaches and spread out the plate, so it looked like I'd eaten more than I actually had. There was chocolate cake for dessert, but Thomas's mom went around slicing a piece onto each of our plates, which were still covered with chicken and gravy. By that point, my stomach was growling, so I scoffed down a top layer of cake which hadn't touched anything else. I wanted to leave. Faking a bellyache, I asked if they would call my mom and have her come pick me up. Thomas's dad raised an eyebrow. No need. We have a special remedy. He told the rest of the family to pray for my health and led me out of the room. The front door was on my left, and I briefly considered making a run for it, but the second I did, Mr. Donovan's hand clamped around my shoulder, tight. His smile never wavered, but something about his eyes made me break out in goosebumps, like an implied threat. So I let him guide me into a vintage bathroom. There was a covered cabinet above the sink, and the tub was already full. A thick layer of scud, plus a few dead FLIs floated along the surface. Mr. Donovan poured something into the murky water, salt maybe, and ordered me to strip off my t-shirt so I could dip my midsection in. I told him I'd made a miraculous recovery. "Oh, the power of prayer," he said, grinning so wide I could count the back teeth. After that, he announced it was time for bed, despite the fact it wasn't even dark yet. Upstairs, at the very far end of the hall, a huge object spanning the width of both walls was covered by another sheet. We got ushered me into Thomas's room, which was even more dull and lifeless than the rest of the house. A queen-sized bed, one small cupboard, and a single wooden chair tucked in the corner. We needed to share the bed, but only after another round of prayer. Then it was lights out before 9 o'clock. Alone with my friend, I rolled over and asked what religion his family practiced anyway. He gave the vaguest answers possible, and when I pushed him, became hyper-defensive. So I said, "Hey, do you ever want to punch Miss Henry right in her stupid ugly face?" That made him laugh. Away from his parents, he became more like his school self. Not normal, but closer than before. We argued over who the hottest girl in class was, followed by the most annoying. Without meaning to, I brought up one who always teased him, and it was like all the energy leaked out of my new friend. "I know everybody thinks I'm odd," he sighed. "They just need to get to know you like I did. They'll come around. You think so?" "Absolutely." He smiled. Then, after a little while, he said, "Hey, wanna see something creepy? I'll show you if you think you're brave enough not to wet the bed." I rolled my eyes. He wanted to rattle me, like when we played ball. "Sure, we've gotta wait until Mother and Father retire for the night." I kept asking what he had planned, but he wouldn't answer. He got a kick out of keeping me in the dark, I think. He waited until the house fell quiet, and then swung his legs out of bed. This way, in the chilly, dark hall, enough moonlight shone through the windows beside the staircase to see by. As we tiptoed past several closed doors, the crying returned, growing louder as we approached the object beneath the black sheet. Not my imagination, then. Facing me, Thomas whispered, "Don't worry if he looks at you. Just make sure you look away fast." "You'll be fine so long as you look away fast." Before I could ask what that meant, he crouched down, grabbed the corner of the sheet, and pulled it back, revealing an antique armoire. Suddenly, the crying became less muffled. A mirrored panel ran along the bottom section, surrounded by fine, gargoyle-like carvings. Still holding the blanket, Thomas pushed his left ear against the carpet and stared at the glass. "He's there. Come look quick. I just wanted to get this over with." I lay down. For a second, I stared at the reflected hall, confused about why we were even there. But then an out-of-place shape caught my eye. I told myself it was my reflection, but then realized I had no reflection. A boy was standing in the corner with his back to us. His shoulders went up and down like he couldn't stop sobbing. "Do you see him?" Thomas asked. I swallowed a gulp, my blood running cold. "Niato, huh?" My brain scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, or a nasty prank. I looked behind me. Nothing. Only a bare patch of wall. "He's not there," Thomas said. "Only in the mirror." When I looked back, the boy was much closer and crouched on his side, nose to nose with me. His features were all stretched out, long and narrow like a funhouse mirror, and he had a shock of blonde hair to go with them. His thin lips twisted into a grotesque smile as the boy reached out to me, the tips of his fingers pushing through the glass into reality. I couldn't move a muscle until his face is only inches away from mine, his breath blasting me in the face like a gust of cold air. I scrambled away. If my throat hadn't hitched itself shut, I would have screamed. Quickly, Thomas dropped the sheet and dragged me up by the shoulder, then shoved me down the hall. Behind us, the armoire thrashed from side to side, its hinges squeaking, the boy crying again. Now his voice had an almost hysterical quality. Back in the safety of his room, Thomas pressed his ear against the door until the armoire quieted down. "We are blessed Father didn't hear," he said. "Now we sleep. Father said we aren't to rise before he wakes us to begin the morning ritual. He must not have been the least bit scared by what we saw, because he ushered me into bed and dozed off straight away. But my body wouldn't quit trembling. What was that thing in the mirror? Were there more of them? Is that why they hung sheets everywhere? But why keep any mirrors at all? One thing was for sure. I couldn't spend the night in that house. But Thomas's dad would never let me go. I needed to get the hell out of there without being seen. After Thomas's breathing eased into a rhythm, I swung my legs onto the floor and tiptoed out of the room toward the stairs. But as I approached the top, footsteps came clomping along. I ducked behind the nearest door. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mr. Donovan march past with a rectangular object tucked beneath his arm. There was a tinkling sound from beneath the sheet. He carried it over to Thomas's room, grunting the whole way, and disappeared through the door. My stomach lurched into my throat. I didn't want to find out what he had planned. I flew down the stairs carefully, quietly. I kept my hand against the wall for guidance. The front door was locked. My bike still was in the garage, I hoped. But how did I get there from the landing? Above my head, there were angry shouts of, "He's gone." No time for plans. I sprinted around the ground floor, flying from room to room. Cries rang out in everyone, and now the objects beneath the sheets danced on the walls, bouncing around. The crying child sounded terrified now, like they were in pain. Past the kitchen, there was a cramped utility room with another door. The temperature plummeted as I bolted through it, into the garage. The light switch was on the inside wall. I flicked it, then a naked bulb blinked on. Junk was scattered everywhere. Car parts, stepladders, boxes of old newspapers, and more sheets thrown over different mirrors, each flapping and twisting. There were more cries, except not just the boy, and for a second I was afraid to move, but then a door slammed shut behind me, and I ran for it. My bike was propped up against the wall beside the exit, its handlebar stubbornly tangled with a Christmas tree. After a few tugs, it came loose, and it was like setting off a Rube Goldberg machine. A mop and bucket fell into a stepladder, which clattered to the floor and sent a bag of marbles sprawling across the floor, and so on. I grabbed the bike's handlebars. The exit was one of those old fold-up doors you needed to twist the handle to open. My hands were shaking so badly I needed to set the bike aside and focus solely on this task. The door rotated up. Behind me, Thomas's dad burst into the room, and for the first time he'd stopped smiling. He rushed after me but struggled to get through the minefield of junk. My bike's rear wheel became tangled with a sheet, and when I started running, it came away like a magician ripping away a tablecloth. I heard the mirror fall to the floor and shatter. Laughter rang out, and when I glanced back over, my shoulder-bone-thin arms were reaching out of the glass towards Mr. Donovan. As the garage light rapidly flicked on and off, Mr. Donovan screamed. I will never, as long as I live, forget the terror in that scream. Pure adrenaline got me out of there. Without slowing down, I sprinted to the top of the driveway and leapt onto the bike and flew down the hill. Behind me, screams rang out from deeper in the house. I didn't stop to look back. Mom wasn't pleased about me cycling home so late, but I made up an excuse about Thomas's family getting sick and needing to leave in a hurry, so she let it slide. I knew she'd never believe my story. I tried faking an illness to get out of school because I was so anxious about seeing Thomas again, but she was having none of it. I spent all of Saturday and Sunday wondering about what I'd seen. On Monday, my desk buddy sat without breathing a single word. We never spoke again, and we didn't bump elbows once. To my great relief, Miss Henry announced Thomas's family had moved again the very next day. I never saw him after that, although for a while I had nightmares about his dad dragging me back inside their house, and they tend to flare up anytime I see a mirror-fronted armoire. Story 2. I was an exorcist in training. What we encountered was no ordinary demon. There is no official record of the exorcism we performed at 1237 Palmer Avenue in Los Angeles last November. The church encourages us not to speak to the press about such things anyway, as our work tends to be sensationalized. In truth, most cases we investigate aren't possessions at all, just ordinary, tragic mental health issues wearing the trappings of religion. I was still only a year into my apprenticeship back then. Up to that point, even in the few instances when I'd witnessed a genuine possession, the process of exorcism was far more mundane than the movies would have you believe. My mentor, Father Anthony, would simply follow the protocols as outlined by the Holy See, sprinkling with holy water, laying of hands, and exfoliation, along with the recitation of the prescribed prayers. Only once had I seen the basic prayers fail. It was a case where the entity within an elderly woman had been allowed to fester possibly as long as 5 years. The family had spent half a decade ignoring the problem, ascribing it to ordinary dementia, even as her behavior grew worse and worse. We had been called in after she'd twisted the head off a beloved family cat, all while invoking the names of minor demons she had no business knowing. Even then, Father Anthony had been able to remove the demon in less than a week, relying on the prayer to St. Michael and a silver cross that had once belonged to Pope Leo XIII. Nothing could have prepared either of us for what we found on Palmer Avenue. We were sent there at the behest of Father Philippe, a parish priest who noticed that Maya Knowles, one of the young women attending his church, had missed several weeks of Sunday Mass. It's unfortunately common for young people to fall out of love with the faith, but it raised a small flag for the Father Philippe, who caught up with her mother, Sharon, one day after Mass to ask her if anything was wrong. Sharon immediately burst into tears, confessing that her previously bright, cheerful daughter had become a recluse overnight, refusing to leave her room. Again, such things happen. But it aroused the Father Philippe's interest, and he paid the family a visit a few days later. What he witnessed upon entering the girl's room was enough to make him call us immediately. Rather than paraphrase, I'll include a transcription of the voicemail he left here. There was a foul smell. It hit you all the way down the hall. Some kind of cocktail of sweat and excrement. It grew more powerful as I approached Maya's room, such that I was hesitant to enter. At the doorway, I hesitated. That's when I heard the awful growling. Like an animal's stomach, left empty far too long. Nothing about it sounded the least bit human. I said a prayer and entered. The girl I almost hesitate to call her, that now had been beautiful when I last saw her. So much so that she'd been the subject of several confessions from teenage boys in the parish, all unable to take their eyes off of her. Adult men, too. Her mother had been pushing her toward a career in modeling, television, something I warned them both about. Pride. The dangers of the superficial. Of course, I'm a priest-in-law. I have many such conversations. I will say that Maya's mother was particularly obsessed with her daughter's career in a way that gave me pause, but I felt that if I confronted her too harshly about the subject, I might push her away from the faith entirely. When I walked into the room, I had to suppress my urge to vomit. Maya lay in a bed in the center of the dark bedroom. Something, its texture uneven and smudged with fingerprints, had been rubbed and dried over the windows, blocking out the light. Despite the near dark, I could just make out Maya's skeletal form, her skin clinging like tissue to her bones, exposing every crease. The growling sound was emanating from her stomach and up her throat, the low pitch more like the death row of some great beast than a teenage girl. There was a scratching sound filling the room too, and when I looked closer, I realized that she was weakly moving her arm, grabbing handfuls of dry rice from a 50-pound bag by her side. She moved her hand to her lips, eating the dry rice whole before going back for another handful. Looking around by her bedside, I saw at least 6 or 7 similar bags littered on the floor. "Like what you see?" she asked me. Of course not. I'm not exactly your type, am I? Couldn't get hard for a girl like me if you tried. Maybe worth a shot, though. Why don't you come a little closer? Give me a little kiss? I knew in that moment that I was in mortal danger. Behind me, the door began to close on its own accord, and as I reached back to stop it, it slammed shut. I heard the crunch of bone as my fingers smashed in the doorframe. The break was bad enough that I could see the white of my bone through the skin, and I was bleeding profusely. Suddenly, the girl was up. Without a sound, she'd moved to the foot of the bed, her legs, no thicker than pool cues, dangling over the side. "You smell amazing, Father," she said. She stood, and her posture was bent, unnatural. One of her knees seemed to bend the opposite way. One of her arms seemed to have broken in so many places that it flapped like a tentacle. With my good hand, I pulled the door open as hard as I could, trying to free my limp fingers and escape before she could reach me. She stepped deliberately. I sensed that she could move faster if she desired, but she enjoyed watching me squirm. Almost without thinking, I began to recite a Hail Mary in the original Latin, something that has always brought me peace. As the words exited my mouth, I could tell that Maya was bothered, even taking a small step back. "Shut up," she was muttering. "Shut up about that bitch," but I refused to stop. And as I did, I was able to pry the door open, a little at a time. Then, all at once, Maya was screaming, commanding me to close my mouth. Suddenly, the door flew open, and I stumbled through, shutting it behind me as fast as I could. After that, there was only silence. No one has heard a thing from inside the room since then. I have instructed Maya's mother to avoid going inside at all costs. We need help desperately. A strange look had crossed Father Anthony's face after he heard the message. He went to consult a few old books in his personal library as I listened to the message on repeat, trying to sift through the details. "How bad is it?" I asked when he returned. "It is what it is," he said. "The protocols are clear. We go. We evaluate. Should it turn out to be a major exorcism, we will use the prayer to St. Michael for as long as it takes. Pack your large suitcase." "It may be a while, Father," I asked. "Has the prayer ever failed to remove the entity?" He shook his head. "Demons are cowards by nature. With some luck, within a few weeks it will flee, just as its brethren have before. Father Anthony and I were different in our faith. Mine was almost like romance, swelling one day and waning the next, ever present, but varying vastly depending on my mood. His was steady. To Father Anthony, the universe was perfectly ordered, bound by immutable laws. To him, the prayers always worked. Just as one pool ball colliding with another would predictably transfer its force, so too would his prayers send demons reeling. "You look worried," he said, as I played the message again. "Don't. It's unseemly for a man of the cloth. Pack your bag. By now, you should know that time is critical." Though he was almost steady as always, I noticed a slight tick as he spoke, like his mouth couldn't stop twitching. Looking down, I saw he was carrying a small pouch of red velvet that I'd never seen before. "Just a precaution," he said. "Hopefully something we don't need until much further into your training. I never expected to become an exorcist. My family wasn't even Catholic growing up. My parents were hippie types, mercurial in their beliefs. For a while, we attended a Baptist church. Then, just as I'd finally learned all of the lyrics to the hymns, we moved 2 towns away, where my mom got swept up in the Kabbalah and tried to drag us all into it with her. Before I was a teenager, I'd spent a day or 2 in a mosque, a Swinomish smokehouse, and a Gnostic temple. It was my wife, Sophia, who brought me into the faith. She had grown up in a big Italian-American family in New York, and for her Catholicism was the same as family. I converted to marry her. All it took was a few months of classes and a ceremony on Easter. I didn't even ask myself if I believed in God. It was enough to believe in Sophia. She was a true believer in the best sense of the word, generous to a fault, always exhausting herself trying to keep us all happy. All year, she sewed quilts, using them as Christmas presents or baby shower gifts. Several times, she tried to teach me how to sew, but I was hopeless, clumsy. She loved me anyway. Then, one Thanksgiving, after staying up far too late drinking wine and prepping vegetables, she woke up and decided to run to the store for pre-made dinner rolls. It was icy. She wasn't even speeding, but it didn't matter. She skidded into oncoming traffic at the wrong time. She died instantly. After she was gone, none of my usual crutches dulled the pain. Alcohol. Throwing myself into work. Exercise. It all felt hollow, insufficient to replace Sophia. We held a funeral mass shortly after she died, and it was the first time I felt an ounce of peace. The light streaming in from the stained-glass windows suddenly seemed different to me, as if heaven were actually on the other side, if I could just step through them. I found myself going to church more often after that, not just on Sundays, but on weekdays too, right after work. I'd watch the darkening sky through the stained glass as I knelt in one of the back pews, and for a short time, I felt like Sophia wasn't so far away. Eventually, the priest there, Father Ignatius, would gently tell me that it was well past closing time, and I would leave. Until one day, he asked me to come with him. "I wonder if you'd consider joining the priesthood," he said. "Some widowers do." I laughed. "I'm barely Catholic," I said. "I just joined for her." He shook his head. "I don't believe you. The house at 1237 Palmer Avenue was decadent, even by LA standards. Set back on a nearly full-acre lot bordered by a tall stucco wall, the house soured up 3 stories, all elegant metal and glass. Later, we would learn that the girl's father had paid well over $1 million for the architect alone before construction ever started. As we approached, we noted that one bedroom where the light shone brown red, though a darkened window. Reflexively, we both made the sign of the cross. Sitting on the front steps, we met Father Philippe, who was half asleep, slumped against the rail. Though he couldn't have been much older than 30, his skin appeared sallow. His eyes ringed like a cold, distant planet. His hand was wrapped in a thick bandage crusted with blood. Father Anthony, Father Matthew. He reached out, his hands shaking before breaking down in sobs. I could tell Father Anthony was unsettled at this greeting. "You have done your part now, Father Philippe," he said. "You should go back to your church. Pray. Rest." Father Philippe shook his head. "I won't leave until we've seen this through," he said. "I made a promise to myself." Father Anthony shook his head. "That's merely pride whispering in your ear," he said. "Please go." Father Philippe reached down into his pocket and found a piece of candy. He popped it into his mouth. His breath was rank, and I wondered how long it had been since he last brushed his teeth. "I'll just wait a little longer," he said. "Just until you've had a chance to go in." I could tell Father Anthony wasn't happy about this, but he was eager to go in and get to work. We brushed past Father Philippe, who fell back into a ball on the steps, and we walked to the door. Father Anthony rang the doorbell once, then waited patiently. After perhaps 15 seconds, he scowled and rang it again. "Mrs. Knowles." He called, but there was no response. Then, finally, he turned the knob and we entered. Immediately, the stench hit us both. The house smelled as if the walls around us would burst, sending a flood of excrement down to cover our feet. Father Anthony raised a handkerchief to his nose, passing another to me so that I could do the same. Again, he called for Mrs. Knowles, but there was no response. Somewhere, up above, we heard a skittering sound, knocks on the wood, like someone on stilts running through the hall. Father Anthony fumbled in his pocket, removing his silver cross. He began to wave it ever so slightly back and forth, like a hypnotist's pendulum, as he recited a Hail Mary. "Mrs. Knowles?" I shouted, and the thumping sound stopped. "She's in the kitchen," said a voice that made my heart nearly stop. It was deep and resonant, and seemed to speak from all around us. Father Anthony gestured for me to go to the kitchen. "You find the mother. I'll go up to talk to the girl," he said. He had removed the red velvet bag from his pocket and was loosening its drawstring. "Maybe we should call for assistance," I said, but he shook his head. "If we follow the rites, we will prevail. Remember, God is on our side. Go find the mother and get her out of the house. Hurry." Without another word, he headed up the stairs. I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, almost running. Then, as I reached the archway separating the rooms, I stopped and vomited, barely able to comprehend what I was seeing. There in the kitchen lay Mrs. Knowles, or rather, what was left of her. In the center of the room lay a pile of bloody broken bones, all stacked in a messy pile, and topped with a broken skull matted in blonde hair. Most of her, the flesh, the organs, the brain and muscle, the fat was all gone. Time may have passed. I can't be sure. My vision seemed to go black and then red. Strangely, I found myself oddly hungry, so much so that I nearly opened the refrigerator to look for something to eat. Then I heard a scream from upstairs, and my senses came back to me. I ran through the hall and up the staircase, 2 steps at a time. It was clearly Father Anthony screaming, his cries mixed with the prayer to Saint Michael. "Thy thousand hosts are spread embattled o'er the azure sky. But Michael bears thy standard dread, and lifts the might cross on high." The prayer was punctuated with repeated shrieks, both from him and someone else. I ran down the hallway toward Maya's room, the rank smell growing so thick it seemed to thicken the very air. In the room, I found them. They were coiled together, like 2 pythons both trying to strangle the other. Blood was everywhere, flowing freely from wounds on both of their bodies. Somehow, in the few minutes since we'd parted ways, Anthony had managed to lose both legs and his left arm, all bitten down to the nubs. Another long gash had opened his belly, and his guts were hanging out of him. With his one good arm, he was holding something gleaming up to Maya's face. Through the hazy air and the blood, it took me a few seconds to recognize it as a needle and silver thread. Somehow, he had managed to apply 3 or 4 stitches across the girl's mouth, sealing it almost shut. Now, even as he tried to apply a 4th stitch, she bit at his fingers with the side of her mouth, severing the pinky and chewing it with obvious joy. Father Michael cried out, but continued the prayer. He, in that sign, the rebel powers did, with their dragon prince, expel, and hurled them from the heavens' high towers, down like a thunderbolt to hell. Every part of me wanted to run. If I'm being honest, I wanted to tear my collar and robes from my body and sprint into the LA night, never looking back. But something in me refused. Instead, I sprang forward, taking the shaking needle from Father Anthony's shaking fingers. "I did everything right," he said weakly. And then the light in his eyes went out. Maya turned her attention to me now, trying to bite me, shouting curses. "Run, run, run, little assistant, you're in over your head." I stared at the silver thread dangling from her mouth. I'd never even heard of such a thing. There were rules, protocols that I'd never even heard of, that I wasn't ready for. The girl smiled, pulling at the thread, beginning to unravel Father Anthony's careful work. I saw now that she would open her mouth wide and eat me down to the very bone, that I would scream while she chewed up my lungs and heart. Indeed, She was reaching for Anthony's guts now, slurping his intestines through the small hole still left on the side of her mouth. Except that I wasn't seeing any of that now. I was in a quiet room with Sophia, sitting side by side. On ours laps was a quilt. She was smiling, the light catching the strands of her light brown hair. "I can't do it," I was saying, fumbling with the needle. "Of course, you can," she said. "It's not science. It's just in and out. In and out." "We know you're good at that," I blushed, the needle slipping out from between my fingers. "Just relax," she said. "Here, let me guide you." She put her hand on mine, her flesh warm and soft. Slowly, she guided my fingers down through the soft white fabric. Then suddenly, I was back. I watched my fingers slip the silver thread through Maya's lips. Only a crack at the side of her mouth remained exposed. "You're different than them," she said, her words more muffled now, and it almost sounded like a normal girl's voice. "You carry someone with you." "Who?" I used the moment of surprise to apply the final stitch, blood pooling around the thread as I cinched it shut, silencing her forever. As soon as it was done, she fell back in the bed, her eyes closing as sleep took her. After a while, after I'd gotten my thoughts together, I called Father Anthony's superior at the Vatican to explain what had happened. I tried to stay calm, to explain things as accurately as possible, but I'm sure my voice was shaking. Around me, the worst of the stench was gone, though ordinary one's blood, bile persisted. Still, the air was that much cleaner than before, and I found I was able to breathe. I expected him to doubt my story, but he just listened without saying anything. Then, finally, as I reached the end of what I had to say, he spoke. "You were able to apply the stitches yourself." "Just the last couple. Father Anthony did most of the work." He paused for a moment. "Did you have any other outside help?" I thought about that for a second about Sophia. "Maybe you did well," he said. "We will send people for both you and the girl. They will bring you back here to the Vatican." "Is that the protocol?" There was a brief pause. Father Anthony was a firm believer in protocol. "Are you?" "No," I said after a moment. "Good," he said. "Then we will have much to discuss when you arrive." Story 3. My mentally disabled brother spent 3 days in the house with my mother's dead body. He says something inhuman slunk through the house at night. I moved away from my hometown a few years ago. My father had committed suicide when I was a small boy, going out to the barn and shooting himself in the face with a shotgun. I barely remember him still. The only thing that stays with me from that day was my mother's agonized, wrecking sobs when she found his mutilated body. Sometimes, during nightmares late at night, I still hear those same screams, repeating over and over like a skipping record. My little brother, Charlie, was born with Down syndrome. My mother took care of Charlie by herself since I moved away. I rarely talk to my family, something I feel increasingly guilty about looking back. Unbeknownst to me, my mother had a worsening addiction to pills and alcohol. To this day, I don't know if she intended to kill herself or not. But after examining her corpse, the medical examiner concluded that she had a lethal combination of benzos, morphine, and vodka in her system. When they found her body rotting in the summer heat in her bedroom 3 days later, they said she had one eye half open, her arm still outstretched towards the telephone, as if trying to call for help even in death. The police ended up finding my number a few days later. I lived over 5 hours away, but when I heard Charlie was being kept at the police station, I immediately took the day off of work and headed back towards my hometown of Frost Hollow. I remember driving through the rural town, a place of rolling hills and thick, dark forests, thinking how dead and empty the whole area looked. A lot of the houses that had been there when I was younger had since been demolished or lay barren, dilapidated and rotting. The police station in the center of town seemed to be one of the few places still open. I looked at the shuttered windows lining both sides of Main Street, seeing one out of business, sign after another. On the bright side, however, there were plenty of parking spots along the cracked, empty streets. I got out of the car, seeing a feral, mange-covered dog ripping through bags of garbage in a nearby alleyway. The sickly sweet smell of decaying trash filled the air, thick and cloying. I entered the glass doors of the police station, finding an old crone pecking at a keyboard behind the front desk. She looked like a twisted dwarf, her eyes magnified to giant orbs behind her glasses. She looked up at me with a pale, bloodless face. "Yes," she said in an annoyed voice. "I'm here to pick up Charlie Benton," I said. The old woman looked behind her, where a tanned woman in a police officer's uniform was leaning against a rusted metal cabinet, looking through a file. "Sergeant Alvarez deals with that," the old woman spat, looking back at her computer. The police officer sighed, looking up at me with humorless eyes. A few moments later, she circled around, coming out the tinted black glass door around the side. The slow, erratic typing of the old woman continued ringing out like the ticking of a failing heart. Sergeant Alvarez had wide, almond-shaped eyes and jet-black hair pulled back in a ponytail. She did not look happy to see me. "You're Dennis?" she asked. I nodded, pulling out my license. She inspected it closely before handing it back to me. "We found your brother in quite a state. He was covered in blood, naked from the waist up, wandering through people's backyards at night. When the police found him, at first he was unresponsive, as if he were sleepwalking or something. His eyes were open, but he was not talking and appeared to be looking at things only he could see. After about 30 seconds of this, they said he appeared to wake up, though he still wasn't giving coherent answers at first. He just kept saying, 'She was walking, she was walking.' Eventually, after a lot of trying, they were able to ask him about why he was wandering at night and why he was covered in injuries and blood. Your brother said something kept hurting him in the house at night and that he had to get out. He had marks on his body," Sergeant Alvarez said, her eyes suspicious. Intelligence gleamed behind them. "The strangest thing. It looked like someone had burned hand marks into his back and shoulders. I found this information disturbing on some instinctive, primal level, but I didn't know why. Who could have done that?" I asked, confused. She shrugged. "Charlie couldn't tell us," she said. "Your mother had been dead for 3 days by that point, and the wounds on Charlie's body were fresh. Do you know if there was anyone else who regularly visited or lived in the house with them?" I shook my head. "My mother had no friends," I said. "She was practically a hermit. She used to just stare out the window for hours when I lived there like a zombie. No one ever came to visit her." The black doors swung open again, and Charlie stood there next to a muscular police officer. Charlie's face had his typical vacant stare. Charlie appeared in his mid-20s, a sweaty, lumpy mass of a human being wearing a tight pinky and the Brain t-shirt. His enormous belly hung over his belt, his shirt seemingly always pulled up to expose a few inches of naked flesh. He had confused, mud-brown eyes that rarely focused on anything for longer than a few seconds. But there were other times Charlie seemed to have an almost photographic memory, repeating entire conversations in his strange, droning monotone, even months after they had taken place. "She is dead," he said, his muddy brown eyes unfocused. "She is dead." She was walking. I squinted at him, feeling cold dread dripping down my heart. "Charlie, buddy, it's okay now," I said, taking a step towards him. He looked up abruptly, seeming to just now realize that I was there. "Dennis!" he screamed, his enormous belly jiggling as he ran forward. He wrapped his thick arms around me, his face filled with an innocent, childlike excitement. He lifted me off the ground. A breathy exhalation of fetid breath hit me directly in my face. I grunted as he squeezed the air out of my lungs. Charlie was immensely strong and often didn't realize his own strength. "You're crushing me, buddy," I grunted in a small, crushed voice. Charlie dropped me back down on the ground. I looked closer at him, seeing healing, sickly wounds peeking above the neckline of his t-shirt. A rainbow of black, purple, and blue marks hung there, formed in the shape of long, twisted fingers. The worst of them had drops of pus falling from the burnt craters in the center. I wondered how many more lay hidden beneath his clothes. Sergeant Alvarez gave me her card, telling me to call her if I found out any more information about the case or if Charlie remembered anything or was able to give more information in the future. I wondered who could have possibly been hurting Charlie. It made me feel sick and angry, thinking of someone following him around, scaring him and attacking him during the night. Charlie already hated and feared the dark as it was, adding another layer of cruelty to the disturbing case. He had feared it ever since he was a small boy. I walked him out of the police station, buckling him into the passenger seat of the car. As I sat down in the driver's seat, he looked over at me. Sweat glistened on his upper lip, and his goofy bowl cut of a haircut was sticking up in random spots. "Dennis, I saw her," Charlie said in his flat monotone. "She was walking. At night, I heard her feet. In the dark, I heard her feet. Who was, buddy?" I asked. "Who did that to you? Did someone hurt you during the nighttime?" He nodded. A single tear fell from his squinty eyes, dripping down his round face. "It wasn't, Mom." He shook his head in response. His lips started quivering. He leaned close to me, whispering in a hoarse, terror-stricken voice. "The bone-faced woman," he hissed, breaking down in tears. I had contacted a team to remove the soiled items in the master bedroom after receiving a call from the police. The team told me it would be a fairly easy job and that I would be able to stay in the house later that night. With no other living family except Charlie, I would undoubtedly inherit it anyway, though I had absolutely no intention of keeping it. I wanted to sell it as soon as possible, but I would have to go through everything and decide what, if anything, I wanted to keep. All of Charlie's stuff was also still in the house, which I knew we would need to go through and package regardless. It was a Friday, and I had the weekend off work. My plan was to finish moving everything out of my mother's house that weekend. Charlie and I pulled into the sprawling property that night, turning onto the flat dirt driveway towards the old colonial. Sharp stones crunched rhythmically under the tires. I took in the sight, the large windows and wrap-around porch of the dark purple house. I saw my childhood neighbor, Sloan Herbick, standing outside on his front lawn. Behind him loomed his Victorian house, a blood-red building of sharp turrets and dark, dusty windows. Sloan Herbick was a strange man in more ways than one. He had been burned horribly as an infant in a crib fire, barely surviving with his life. Melted folds of lumpy scar tissue covered most of his body, including his face and head. Miraculously, he hadn't lost his eyesight, nose, or lips, but both of his ears were missing as well as all the hair on his head except his long black eyelashes. His horrifyingly scarred body looked nearly as pale as an albino's, but his eyes were as dark as sin. I remembered Sloan as an arrogant, aloof man with no friends, about 10 years older than myself. According to what my mother told me as a teenager, Sloan's mother had gone missing when I was little, during the time when they were constructing our then brand new home in Frost Hollow. By now, I thought, he must be at least 40, though the keloid scars and mutilated ridges of flesh running over his entire body made it impossible to tell. As I got out of the car, I gave a neighborly wave, but Sloane ignored me. He stared fervently down at the hole, slamming the sharp tip of the shovel into the earth, over and over again at a frenetic pace. I walked by Charlie's side up the rickety wooden steps to the front porch, pulling the spare house key out of my pocket from so many years ago. With trembling fingers, I slid the key into the lock, finding that my keys still worked, as I knew they would. The door opened onto a dark, sinister hallway. A nauseating odor emanated from the house, blowing out the front door like the rancid breath of some primordial monster. It was the smell of rotting bodies, clotted blood, and infection. It left a slightly sweet aftertaste. Gagging, I flipped on the light switch. I took a step forward, but Charlie didn't follow. He stared up at me with an unusual intensity, taking his huge, round arms and crossing them over his chest. The front of his dirt-caked sneakers came up the perimeter of the threshold, but he refused to go any further. He just shook his greasy, sweat-covered face. "Come on, buddy," I said encouragingly, giving him a wide smile. "What's wrong?" He pointed behind me, down the hallway. I instantly looked over my shoulder, my heart leaping up like a jackrabbit. Having watched far too many horror movies, I expected to see some blood-streaked hags standing there with a face like a skull and an ear-to-ear grin. But the hallway lay empty. "She's still here," Charlie said slowly, his eyes giant glassy orbs of terror. "She is dead. Mom's not here, buddy," I answered, ambling back toward him and taking one of his enormous hands in mine. I could feel the width of it, the smooth flatness of his palms, except for one thick ridge. "Mom's at the funeral home. We're going to see her Sunday, remember?" Charlie shook his head again, his hair flying everywhere. "This place is bad," he said. "We've got to stay here for the weekend." "Charlie," I responded, feeling a rising sense of irritation. "I already explained it all to you. The house is fine. They took the dead body out already, so what's the problem?" "You'll be with me the whole time. It will be bad," Charlie said, sweating heavily. "It won't be scary, buddy. I promise." Looking back, it is hard to imagine any more untrue words than those. Much of the stuff from my mother's room had been taken out by the cleaning team. They told me that some of her fluids had burst from her body, staining the mattress and bed frame with their black rot. Luckily, not much had gotten on the floor, but a small puddle had dripped down. The guest bedroom was directly underneath Mom's room, just a small square room on the first floor with a bed, a dresser, and a TV. I kept the bedside lamp on all night. On the ceiling of the room, there was a Rorschach ink blot of dead, rotted fluids that still needed to be cleaned up. It was about the size of a basketball and looked like an eye. It had a dark circular spot in the center, followed by thin, black tendrils that cracked their way towards the oval perimeter of the stain. Charlie crawled into bed next to me, putting a heavy, hot hand on my shoulder before falling asleep almost instantly. But I couldn't sleep. After what felt like an eternity, I looked over at the red lights of the alarm clock. Seeing it was 3:32 a.m., I swore under my breath, sensing that my insomnia would not leave me alone this weekend in this place of horrors. At exactly 3:33, a jarring mechanical shrieking started outside. I jumped up in bed. Charlie awoke instantly. He sat up so fast that he smacked his head on the wall with a dull bunk. "What the fuck is that noise?" I hissed, jumping out of bed. I looked up at the stain as I went, giving it a distrustful glance backwards. The mechanical caterwauling seemed to be growing louder as I made my way toward the front of the house. I went to the front window, seeing Sloane Herbick running a wood chipper next to his totally dark house. I could just barely make out his dull silhouette, hearing the din of the constant grinding. Charlie gave an incomprehensible scream in the guest bedroom. I heard his heavy footsteps running toward me. His face was red and flushed, his pupils dilated and frantic. The eye moved. He said, his voice having more emotion than I had heard in it in a long time. I blinked, the fog of sleep still clouding my mind. "You mean the stain?" I asked, finally figuring out what he was talking about. "The stain on the ceiling?" He nodded ferociously, bobbing his head up and down quickly. Eventually, I ended up talking Charlie down and getting him back to bed. The stain was still in the same spot, as far as I could tell. Around a.m., the sound of the wood chipper finally died. In the eerie silence of the dark house, I fell into a nightmarish fever dream where I saw women bound with chains in a basement surrounding a mannequin wearing a suit made of human skin. The next morning, I went over to Sloane's house and knocked until he answered. While I waited, I studied the strange gargoyle knocker plastered across the scarlet door. At first, he would only crack it open a fraction of an inch, staring out at me with a single black eye. "Can you not run the wood chipper in the middle of the night?" I asked, giving him a faint, anxious half-smile. "It's keeping me and Charlie from sleeping." "I mean, you had the thing going at a.m. last night. A few heartbeats later, the front door flew open." Sloane took a step towards me, until his scarred, alien face stood only inches from mine. "It's because of my skin, isn't it?" he asked in a hoarse, low voice. He spoke in a strange cadence, mumbling the words in dissonant rhythms. "If someone cut your eyes out so you couldn't see how ugly I am, you wouldn't care about the wood chipper anymore, would you?" I took a step back, the smile peeling off my face. I reached for the canister of police mace in my pocket, gripping it firmly and putting my hand on the trigger. "Sloane, that has nothing to do with that," I answered coldly, narrowing my eyes at him. "Don't act like a goddamn psycho. Look, if you keep that shit up, I'll call the cops. Don't fucking do it again." I had no patience for nutjobs like him. He always gave me the creeps. As a kid, someone had gone around pouring bleach into the eyes of people's cats and dogs, blinding them and leading to some getting euthanized. I always suspected Sloane of doing it, though he never got caught. My brother and I spent the rest of that day packing up anything we wanted to take with us, putting it in boxes and labeling it. Charlie didn't have a lot of possessions, and Mom didn't exactly have a lot of valuable items in her house, so it was fairly quick going. I figured I would either end up selling or donating most of the crap left behind in the end. Before I knew it, the sun had started setting again. The darkness of a moonless sky descended on Frost Hollow like a guillotine blade. My brother and I kept working, mostly in silence, though Charlie would come over and show me random objects he had recently acquired. "Rick," Charlie said, proudly holding up a plush doll of Rick from Rick and Morty. A trickle of fake drool dripped Rick's mouth, and a trickle of real one from Charlie's. I laughed, ruffling his hair as if he were a toddler. "That's right," I answered excitedly. "That's Rick. You like Rick, buddy? You like how he just does whatever he wants whenever he feels like." Charlie nodded excitedly at that. After a couple more hours of sorting, I decided to go to bed. I wanted to leave as early as possible on Sunday morning after the funeral, which was the next day. Charlie followed me like a puppy, his normally unfocused eyes flitting from one side to the other with a kind of intensity I had rarely seen there before. He constantly scanned the shadows as if looking for something. We kept all the lights in the surrounding rooms in the guest bedroom. As I lay there, about to fall asleep, I glanced over at Charlie and saw him staring straight up at the stain with wide, watery eyes. I don't know how long it was later when I awoke suddenly in the pitch black. I blinked quickly, confused. And then I heard it, the noise that had caused me to set up in bed. Right over me, I heard something gurgling and hissing in rhythmic breaths. It sounded as if whatever it was had lungs filled with blood and dirt. The terror I felt at that moment was incomprehensible. But it grew much worse when two burning, skeletal hands reached down and grabbed me. They covered my right arm in an iron grip, the thin, blade-like fingers feeling inhumanly long. I could feel my skin burning and melting. I screamed, kicking out with my legs and trying to pull away. I brought my left hand up, grabbing blindly for the thing's face. I groped in the darkness until I felt it, a face like a skull. It was slick and wet under my touch, sticky with clotted blood. I felt the muscles of its skeletal face thrumming and contracting. The thing had no skin. I repressed an urge to scream, instead reaching for its eyes, even as its burning hands continued yanking at my arm, trying to pull me off the bed. I felt a nose that was just a ragged hole of destroyed flesh, felt the fetid breath passing softly through those mutilated patches. I reached up into its eyes, but there were no eyes there, just two empty sockets. I reached inside and felt the skittering of insect larvae under my fingers. At the back of the empty socket, my fingers groped thin strands like fleshy wires that had been severed. With all of my strength, I stuck my finger deep down into that warm, twisting socket, stabbing my fingernails into the optic nerves and vessels at the back and ripping. The hands on my arm instantly released. I felt some of the melted skin go with them, heard the tearing of my flesh as warm blood instantly dripped from the wounds. Hyperventilating, my breath hissing with pain, I fumbled in my pocket for my lighter. I brought it up, flicking it. I caught a glimpse of the thing my brother called the bone-faced woman, her naked, skeletal body running out of the room with a sickly gurgling of her diseased lungs. Overhead, the stain had turned into a real eye, a fleshy, black thing that flitted over the arm with a dilated pupil. It emanated insanity, its stare glassy and inhuman. Charlie lay on the floor, his eyes open but unseeing. My breath caught in my throat, the burning agony in my arm temporarily forgotten. I ran toward my brother, kneeling down over his limp body and shaking him. I saw fresh burn marks in the shape of a hand on his face, covering his forehead and temples. The cracked, broken flesh dribbled pus and blood like thick, clotted tears down his cheeks. When he didn't respond, I shook him again, grabbing him by the chin and forcing his eyes to meet mine. I saw him blink. He inhaled like a drowning man, grabbing my hand tightly and shaking his head from side to side. "She was here," he whispered. "She is dead, Dennis. She lives in the dirt. We need to get out of here and never come back," I said, trying to pull Charlie up. He was far too heavy. "Can you get up, buddy? Come on, we'll leave now." With great difficulty, Charlie pulled himself up. His eyes started watering as the weeping burn marks continuously dripped a rainbow of clotted fluids. I took out my phone, trying to call for help, but nothing was working in the house anymore. The electricity had gone off, which was why the lights had all gone out, but that wouldn't explain why my fully charged cell phone had gone black as well. Charlie and I stumbled outside. I put him in the passenger's seat of the car, deciding to get the hell out of there and never come back. But when I tried to turn the starter, the car didn't make a sound. The engine didn't even make an attempt to turn over. "It's her," Charlie whispered, his face a mask of terror and pain in the darkness. "The bone-faced woman wants us to stay. Well, she can go fuck herself." I spat, anger and fear mixing in a toxic sludge in my blood. I watched the house closely, seeing the curtains at the front moving. I caught an occasional glimpse of that abomination peeking out at us with her empty eye sockets and skinned face. I looked at Sloane's house, realizing I could call for help from there. He was the only neighbor within a half-mile radius. "Charlie, the car's not working, and I need to call for help. I'm going to go across the street and use Sloane's phone to call the cops. I want you to lock yourself in the car. Don't open the door for anyone except me or the cops. You got that? I asked, keeping a constant watch on the house, expecting the bone-faced woman to slink out after us at any moment. She is dead, Charlie said robotically. She is walking. She will not let us leave. After I had made sure Charlie had locked himself in the car, I sprinted over to Sloane's dark Victorian house. I ran up the porch steps, ready to start knocking frantically on the door. But as soon as I touched it, it creaked slowly open, showing a dimly lit kitchen. A single oven light was turned on. I looked around in disgust. The place was filthy. Mold-covered pots and pans covered the stovetop. Drying crusts of filth covered a mountain of dishes emerging from the sink. Maggots and other insects feasted like kings here. The white reflections of glittering rat and mouse eyes peeked out at me from the corners of the room. "Sloane," I called, not wanting to be too loud. Even though I wouldn't have admitted it to him, I was, quite honestly, terrified of Sloane Herbick. There was something off about that man. I left the kitchen, moving to the living room. There was only a single night light in here. All around me loomed naked human skins nailed to the wall. They rose in 2 rows, the bottom row offset from the top by a few feet so that more of the space could be used. I crept closer with wide eyes, realizing that the vast majority were just latex or silicone. Not all of them, however. Stuck randomly among the fake hanging skins were some that looked different. These looked thicker and had soft ridges running over their surface. I even saw signs of belly buttons, tattoos and nipples on these leathery skins. At that moment, I knew without a doubt that they were human. Many looked ancient and cracked, the leather falling apart at the shoulders or waist. There was a couch covered in what looked like gore in the center of the room, facing a TV and DVD player. On a small wooden table next to it lay a phone and a blood-encrusted meat cleaver. Shaking with excitement and fear, I crept closer to them, immediately grabbing the weapon. I took Sergeant Alvarez's card from my pocket, calling it. She answered on the second ring, sounding tired. "Hello," she said. "Sergeant Alvarez speaking. This is Dennis Benton," I whispered furtively. "I need help immediately. Send an ambulance and police to my mother's house at 332 Angel Trace Road. Something's happened. Where are you right now?" She asked. "I'm at my neighbor's across the street, but there's, like, body parts everywhere. I think he might be a serial killer. I don't know what the fuck's going on here, but please hurry." I gently put the phone back down on the cradle, hearing a floorboard creak behind me. Sloane Herbick stood there, his dark eyes blazing. He pointed a pistol straight at my head. Looking down the barrel felt like looking into eternity. He was wearing a suit made of what looked like pale, white human skin. It covered him from head to foot, hugging his body with precision. All of the thread and sewing marks were expertly hidden. It almost made him look like some strange alien nudist, wearing a suit of white leather. At his feet he had an open canister of gasoline. With practiced ease, he kicked it over, letting the pungent liquid spill out onto the floor all around me. "Hey man, you don't have to do this," I said, trying to act calm but quivering inside. I expected him to pull the trigger at any second, and then it would be lights out forever. "I've already started," he said, grinning and pointing out the window. I saw my house burning across the street. I felt the blood drain from my face as I thought about Charlie, sitting there in the car with his childlike innocence. I hoped he would know to get out in time. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, horrified. "I never did anything to you. Everyone who looked at me did something to me," he spat. "They hated me because I'm ugly and burned. But now I have a new skin, so people can't hate me anymore. I made it myself, and this face?" He pointed at the dried human skin wrapping around his head. "This is my mother's. She was one of my first, but she never truly left, you see. She told me, take it. This is my body given to you. Take my skin, take my face and my hair, and from it make yourself a new body. Make yourself a thing of beauty, as soft and pale as winter moonlight. After I killed her, I buried her under the dirt in your house, back when it was being built. I knew they would pour the foundation the next day. All those tons of concrete covered her, took her away, and then no one ever knew what happened." He shrugged. "It had to be done to make me whole again. No mother could see her own son become a twisted, ugly thing. After all, the rest of the skin mostly came from prostitutes. I find female skin is much softer, more malleable, and easier to work with. They also take better care of their skin than men." He laughed softly at this. "Okay, so you've already finished your suit," I said, sweating heavily. "So let me go. I have nothing to do with this." He smiled an insane rictus grin behind his leathery mask. "I only need one more piece, and that is the soles of the feet," he answered in his cold, psychopathic way. "I'll get those from you. Goodbye, Dennis. It was nice seeing you again." At that moment, Charlie stumbled in the room, his movements loud and ungraceful. Sloane turned, surprised. A heartbeat later, Charlie slammed his heavy body against Sloane's back, sending him flying. The pistol went off, the bullet missing me by inches. I heard it whiz over the top of my head and smash into the ceiling above me. Cold dread worked its way down my spine as I realized I had just missed death by inches. Sloane landed on his stomach at Charlie's feet. Screaming, Sloane put his left hand up, revealing a Zippo lighter there. He flicked it, throwing it at the pile of gasoline. I backpedaled quickly, trying to go around the blazing ball of fire and get to Sloane. "Get the gun," I screamed at Charlie. Charlie looked down at Sloane with slow comprehension dawning in his face. He took one massive sneaker and stomped down on Sloane's right hand with the pistol in it. I heard the bone crack like twigs snapping. Sloane shrieked, trying to pull away, but Charlie continued leaning down on his arm, preventing him from moving it. The fire was creeping at an incredible rate, rising up the walls and across the ceiling. Thick black smoke filled the room, suffocating us. I ran at Charlie, my eyes watering. I realized I was still holding the meat cleaver in one hand. I looked down at Sloane in his suit of human skin, still trying to raise the gun with his broken arm. I wanted to finish this quickly. I brought the knife down into the back of his neck, hearing the bone crack. There was a wet thud and a bubbling of blood as the meat cleaver bit deeply into through his spine, and then Sloane was still. "Come on, Charlie," I said, grabbing his large hand. He wrapped his fingers around mine. Coughing and choking, we stumbled out into the night as police cars started pulling up. The first one had Sergeant Alvarez in it, who ran towards us, helping a stumbling Charlie toward the back seat of her car, where he could sit down and catch his breath. Both houses were on fire now, blazing pillars of flame that rose high into the black, starless sky. At that moment, I only hoped that the flames would eat away the corpse of Sloane's mother, the bone-faced woman.